Ransomware is arguably today's most prolific cyber threat. This can cause a problem for small and medium-sized enterprises that don't have the internal resources or expertise to know where to start. Fortunately, the Institute for Security and Technology created the Ransomware Task Force to address the emerging national and economic security risk posed by ransomware. One of the many outcomes of this is the Blueprint for Ransomware Defense. It's a clear, actionable framework through which SMEs can defend against ransomware. The heart of the blueprint consists of a subset of safeguards found in version 8 of the CIS Critical Security Controls. The group of safeguards is referred to as Implementation Group 1 and represents a minimum standard of information security for all enterprises. This is referred to as essential cyber hygiene. The 14 foundational safeguards are the building blocks that are necessary to establish an enterprise's cybersecurity program. They also enable the implementation of actionable safeguards. The 26 actionable safeguards build on the foundational ones and are all about applying the technical controls needed to protect an enterprise's environment and defend against ransomware and other general, non-targeted cyber attacks. Focusing on 7 major areas, the blueprint helps defend against over 70% of the attack techniques associated with ransomware. The Blueprint for Ransomware Defense would not be possible without the hard work of several contributing organizations. To download the blueprint and take the steps needed to defend against ransomware, visit the IST website.
Hello, and welcome to our second webinar as part of the Ransomware Task Force Blueprint for Ransomware Defense. My name is Hake. I'm one of the co-founders of Resilience Insurance. And today we've got representatives with us from the Center for Internet Security, Venable, and ActZero, which have all been not just Ransomware Task Force members, but also core authors of building the blueprint. This is our second webinar working through all the different parts of the blueprint to go and dive in depth in not just how we envision entities using the blueprint, but also to talk a little bit about why we built it this way and sort of work through any questions that audience members might have. So we're gonna have the discussion today. We also encourage people to put in anonymous questions in the chat. We'll go through each one of our panelists, and then hopefully we'll be able to wrap it up with a good discussion as well too. So please feel free to jump in and give us any questions as we go. Our panelists today include Valecia Stocchetti. She's a senior cybersecurity engineer for the Center for Internet Security. Adam Mansour, who's the Chief Security Officer for ActZero, John Banghart, who's a Senior Director for Cybersecurity at Venable, and once again, my name is Hake with Resilience Insurance. Pleased to be working with everybody here on the task force. Also note too, John and I had the chance to work on the National Security Council together, so it's great to have you back, John, as well too. So what are we doing for our second webinar? Our second webinar is really digging into some of the foundational safeguards around not just preventing a ransomware attack, but also how to respond and recover to it. John and Adam and Valecia have all been instrumental in working through the blueprint as we not just collected different controls that we felt would be most beneficial to small and medium-sized organizations, but more importantly, helping prioritize those recommendations. One of the main recommendations as we built the task force back in 2021 was to say, how do we take all of the knowledge that the different partners and organizations had and then focus all that knowledge specifically, not just on what are technical best practices, but which controls might have the highest return on investment for the group of companies that we were seeing specifically targeted the most by ransomware actors. That really is these small and medium-sized organizations. Some of the stats we looked at say that, potentially up to 70% of the victims that were attacked between 2020 and 2021 were this medium-sized small business organization. And that sort of makes sense too, as the ransomware attacks have shifted from, going after large targets to being more pervasive across small organizations. So as we built this, we really worked to keep in mind what could be a useful tool for organizations that might have limited staff or limited resources. And one of the expertise that we really brought into this was how to prioritize that. And we'll talk a little bit more about that today. I just want to say thank you to all of the entities that helped build this. The ransomware task force has over 50 members. A subset of that, including ActZero, CIS, the Global Cyber Alliance, Security Scorecard, IST, and Resilience, all worked for several months to pull this together and put this document out. And we encourage everybody to follow up with some of the links that were available in the chat or from IST's website in downloading not just the blueprint, but a lot of the tools that are associated with it that groups have contributed for free. So as I noted, our panelists have an incredible background. Valecia is coming in not just as now a senior cybersecurity engineer, but also previously head of the CERT team at the MSISAC, has a lot of great experience actually responding to cyber incidents. Adam is the chief security officer and has a deep background working on security operations, as well as a startup founder and CTO himself, working on innovative services around the SIM space. And as I mentioned, John Banghart has a long career in the federal government, working in the White House as well as in NIST, and he's too modest to admit it, but he was also, I'm sure, one of the chief authors of the cybersecurity framework that was released in 2012. So deep experience. I was very lucky to have worked with John and a lot of folks on here. I myself have a background in the public sector. I spent a long time on the Hill and the Obama administration working on cyber policy before leaving to co-found our cyber resilience startup. So what are we going to do today? So our goals are to not just talk about the blueprint, but also go deep into some of these best practices around incident reporting. Want to talk about some issues around log management. We also mentioned Valicia's has a very deep expertise here. Want to talk about how you build a foundation for strong data recovery. One of the things as a cyber insurance provider that we've seen is the most expensive part of ransomware attacks are around the business interruption and recovery costs. Everybody thinks it's the extortion, but it's really putting your organization back together again, which is why it's so critical then to talk about some of the fundamentals around cyber hygiene. And then we can also hit into what the cyber insurance market looks like and how it's evolving today. So I want to thank all of our panelists here, and let's jump right on into it. So to kick us off here, one of the first questions I wanted to have, and maybe I can throw this over to John, but we've worked together for literally almost a decade. When I think back to it, on building some of these risk frameworks. You've been working on it for much longer than that, back in NIST. Why have another framework? And why is this one different than a lot of the efforts that we've done before in the past?
Yeah, thanks, Davis. Again, thanks for having me here. And as you pointed out, I have been at this a while. I think I've reached the point where I've got enough gray hair now that I get asked questions like, how did you do things in the before times? And I think this is one of those examples where, having worked on frameworks and standards, both actually with Center for Internet Security back in the day, also NIST and elsewhere, I think the important thing is to not lose sight of the fact that no framework really is ever designed to solve the cybersecurity problem, right? I mean, if you go back and you look at the history of standards and frameworks, we've built new ones, but oftentimes we may find that there's a lot of repetition. And I think sometimes the cynic in me will look at that and say, well, what's so different about this framework? What's so different about this? We've been saying these things for 20 years. Why do we need to say them a different way? And I used to think that way. But as I've gotten a few more extra gray hairs, what I've come to realize is that as cybersecurity has become ever so more important, right, to our digital economy, as the digital economy has grown ever so more important, it's important for us as the cybersecurity community to communicate what folks need to be doing in a way that reaches them where they are, right? And so when we talk about small and medium businesses, many of whom may be struggling, are struggling, as you point out, with ransomware or other cybersecurity issues, it's not enough to just say, well, here's the NIST cybersecurity framework, or here's 853, or here's ISO 27001. Those are all great frameworks, right? Those all have great information in them. but they don't help people where they are in their journey, particularly if they're at the beginning of that cybersecurity journey and just not sure how to prioritize. And so when I look at things that we've done over the years, and in particular, when I look here at this blueprint that so many have worked so hard to put together, what strikes me is that while there is a lot of great stuff in here, you talk about the CIS controls, and those CIS controls certainly existed before the blueprint. But what we've done with the blueprint is we've taken it, we've targeted it at a particular audience, we've made it accessible to that audience, we've tried to scope it in a way that can help those that need the most help tackle this problem in a meaningful way without feeling lost, without feeling like they have to spend all their money. And so I think that really is an important element to this. And so I like to see that evolution continue. It will continue. We're never going to solve this problem, right? We're going to have to keep evolving with it. So yeah, I'll leave it at that. I think lots of frameworks. Everybody should pick the one that's going to work best for them. I think the blueprint is great for the audience that it's targeted at.
Yeah, Valecia, let me throw it over to you for a little bit. So one of the core decisions we made early on when we were looking to build some type of guide for small businesses was to look at an existing framework, right? Like John said, we weren't looking to reinvent the wheel. We were looking to evolve what's out there. Do you mind talking a little bit about some of the benefits of why we chose to go with CIS and how that might be applicable to small and medium organizations?
Yeah, sure. So I think, when you're selecting any framework, no matter what it is, there's two things that for small businesses especially you want to look for, is that to start small, no pun intended, and be realistic, right? If a control is going to put you out of business because it's so expensive, maybe it's not the right control for you. Maybe you need to adapt to make sure that it's a compensating control, but it's maybe not going to break the bank. So every organization is going to be different in that regard. I think the blueprint, the reason why the controls fit the blueprint so nicely is because they are really geared towards small businesses. We divided the controls, or the safeguards in the controls, into 3 implementation groups. Implementation group 1, 2, and 3. IG1 is for those small businesses, right? They're the bare minimum of what you need to do to prevent an attack. Well, not prevent an attack, but to protect yourself from, what the fallout that could occur if you get attacked. And so I think there's 2 things with the controls that stick out. They're prioritized and they're practical. And they're especially important when you're shoring up defenses, right? Because if you have a framework that's 1,000 pages and you can't even understand it or comprehend it, then maybe that's not the right framework for a super small business that has no resources or time to dedicate to read and understand that framework. So that's why I think the controls really fit nicely in this blueprint. It really just gives it into little digestible bits that they can use and start to chip away at their defenses. I think the other thing is that, we need to understand that small businesses are not equipped to boil the ocean, so to speak. And so we need to keep that in mind to help foster the adoption in that community rather than scare them away.
No, that's a great point. And really focusing on a tool that's useful for this audience that we've seen be one of the primary groups of victims is really critical. I know IG1 is a good focus on that. Adam, you're a service provider, right? How do you guys obviously have tons of expertise. You guys helped a lot with the prioritization of this. Where do blueprints play a role with you guys, either working on your own product or, helping to educate customers?
Yeah, I mean, certainly when you think about the service provider world, a lot of us are seen sort of as the reseller, right? The group that's here to sell you out of the problem, right? Oh, you've got this particular risk. Well, here's the time and money you need to deploy against it. And, if you think about just the size of the cybersecurity industry and the idea that, ransomware payments are somewhere in the neighborhood of 20 billion a year, and the industry at large is probably 200 billion a year, growing to about 400 billion in 2030. I think the idea is that when the blueprint just seems like a shopping list, it's somewhat, hard for a small to medium business to try to look at it and say, okay, this is good for me. I'm going to start to make decisions where everything on this list, even when we opened the infographic, said, 70% of the attack techniques are going to be mitigated by a framework like this. What about the 30%, right? They want to get on a road to 100% because they're worried about that downtime putting them out of business. But the blueprint really kind of awakens people to the idea that we've known for a long time, which is that you can do this with a lot of different options, right? That there is a framework, there is a blueprint to educate the small to medium business about the decisions that they are making with respect to cybersecurity and where they're putting their time and money, and helping them understand that, technically you could, play capture the flag with an attacker with just Windows, right? It's a lot harder, and you have to be prepared to lose a lot more games, but it is something you can do just through settings, right? So, just understanding that there are facets to these things that need to be visited, not all the time with just, money and a product, but with your attention. That's really what the blueprint really provides, is a guidance on how to kind of connect these things together, what to organize the pieces to this very complex puzzle should look like. They don't have a lot of experience dealing with new threats and ransomware every single day, so they can over-index many times on either recovery or prevention, and there's not a lot of stuff even in between that will sort of help them minimize the impact, right, affordably. So that's what it does for us in the private sector, I think, is help communicate, from a third-party framework, provide a little bit of authenticity to the message that there are things that you can put together here, and that many times you can be agnostic to product and try to put these things together correctly. You just need the help to do that, right? Which is what these frameworks are about.
Yeah, no, it's a great point, Adam. We certainly leverage this. Our underwriters contributed to the prioritization as well based on claims, but we look at it as well too when we're assessing accounts, and also when we're advising back with customers. So I agree that even if you have this expertise, it's nice to have the list to be able to share and educate with others, as otherwise it's just kind of a shopping list, like you said. I wanted to drill back down into this specific section that we're going over today, which focuses a lot on the foundational pieces of incident response. Valecia, if it's all right, I wanted to ask if you could kind of go over why this part of the blueprint was so critical. I know that you did a lot of work on this, and have a lot of experience here working on certain incident response. Do you mind talking a little bit about, in your view, what the minimum elements are to having an incident response plan, or why log management is so important?
Yeah. So, I mean, the reality is, organizations sometimes think, oh, I'm so small, it's not going to happen to me. And I think that mentality really needs to change, right? Because I don't think it's a matter of if anymore. And I'm sure everyone can agree it's a matter of when, which is unfortunate, but you have to be prepared. And so I think that for organizations that don't prepare, they're going to find themselves in a really hard spot when an incident does occur. The biggest thing that I think for organizations is that when they are in the wake of an incident, right, every minute counts. So you can go from 0 to 60 really quick if you have one system down, and then all of a sudden you don't do anything for a few hours or even a day. You wait, and then all of a sudden your entire network's hosed. So time is really of the essence here. And I think the other thing to remember too is that, you mentioned log management. People don't realize sometimes in the beginning that it's extremely important, right? When you're responding to an incident, half the time it's in the logs, because you're trying to find where that system is that started, the ground zero, if you will. And if you can't find that, sometimes you're just putting Band-Aids on the symptoms rather than actually figuring out where the infection is originating from. I've seen in my experience where, somebody keeps 30 seconds of security logs and then they get upset when we can't figure out where it's originating from. Well, that's part of the problem, right? So a little bit of due diligence really does go a long way in preparing for an attack. And then the other thing too to keep in mind is that, for smaller organizations, it's not always feasible to have an in-house incident response team. Many times it's just flat out not, for a lot of them. And so getting that third party or consulting firm that will help during an incident is extremely important. I think the other thing to keep in mind is that having things like up-to-date contact information, that's very important, because you might not think, a small thing like that would make a difference, but in the wake of an incident, if you don't know, phone numbers are no longer valid or email addresses no longer valid, those things start to add time to your response, and time is of the essence when you're responding. So I think there's I covered a lot of little elements in there, but those are some of the key things that I would really excuse me, and implement.
Yeah, no, right. So there's the three major buckets in this section, right? And as you said, there's a process for reporting incidents. There's the log management, so you know where the adversaries are last seen, and you track them down. And then there's also the data recovery process. And as I noted at the beginning, right, this can be, if it's not set up ahead of time, this can be one of the most expensive parts, specifically of a ransomware attack, right? And if you think about it from the attacker's viewpoint, their goal is to cause as much pain as quickly as possible. So in reality, a lot of things they're doing, right, is to increase the cost of data recovery so that you'll just pull the cord and ideally pay the ransom. But what of the things that I'd love to hear, Valecia, is especially from some of your experience working with state and local entities, which we've seen be a large target for ransomware attacks because of their public nature and footprint. What can entities do, especially smaller and medium-sized organizations that don't have tons of staffing and resources? What can they do to make sure that their data recovery processes are really strong and that those investments ahead of time, will make sure that they don't have to reach for the extortion if an event happens?
Yeah, so I think the biggest thing is, well, obviously, like you said, first have a process. That's really important, because if you don't lay that groundwork, then everything else doesn't really fall into place so easily. So I think the other thing is that when you're doing your recovery and all of the preparation before an incident could occur, making sure that you can restore from your backup is really important. I've seen in my experience where organizations say they have backups, and then all of a sudden they're on the same network that got encrypted or ransomed and then encrypted. And so therefore your backups are now encrypted as well, and not in a good way, right? So if you can't recover from backup, you might be forced to either pay the ransom if that's your choice for the organization, or start from scratch. And I've seen decades of information just go right out the door and never recovered, for organizations that have to start from scratch. And when you're, especially in a state and local government, when you have a lot of those documents, think about deeds or birth certificates and things like that, that really affects the bottom line, right? That affects citizens that have that information. They're entrusting the government to secure it, and therefore now it's gone. So I think network segmentation is a big one, having the process. And I also think, I know that testing your backups isn't technically an IG1, but if you can do it, and if it's within your resources, definitely do it, because you don't want to be caught during an incident and figure out at that point that you can't recover from your backups.
Yeah, right. I think you used a great example saying, that firefighters need to know the layout of the building they're going into, right?
Yeah.
And having a process where you're collecting the logs, they can track down where the adversary was last seen. You have that printed out phone list, literally, because you may not be able to access your computers, of up-to-date contact info where you can get a hold of everybody on the weekend when these things always happen. And then also ensuring that everybody knows how to quickly bring the data and the network back online, especially for production-facing systems, right? That's all these things all work together, right? So that those firefighters can get into the building and put out the flame as fast as possible.
Right.
One of the things that we talk to clients a lot about when they onboard is we show them the costs of incidents. And there's one incident that always sticks with me because it's so dramatic. It was a ransomware claim that did not happen to one of our customers, but had been out in the market and had been known. And it was like a $3.5 million loss. And they ended up having to pay the extortion and recover at the same time. And they were in bad straits, but it was sort of the perfect storm, and it was for a manufacturing company. So not even a company that has critical data, but it shut down its operations. And looking at the ratio of payouts, I think it was something like the ransom payment was under six figures, but the entire cost of the incident, the incident response folks coming in, that was a couple $100,000. Insurance covered that, but then the large bulk of the insurance claim was over $2 million in business interruption, because the manufacturer's lines were down for a full month, and those were orders were not coming in, not going out. Adam, you guys do these types of responses all the time. Do you have any thoughts here on, as we kind of look at these three controls, if you only have to put, your first dollars in, how do you avoid the situation so that you're, eating that $2 million after an incident? Let's say the initial controls to stop ransomware have failed. What have you guys seen work best with clients?
Yeah, I mean, certainly if something has failed to stop an adversary and they've got control of your systems in a way that's allowing them to encrypt the operating system one at a time, I mean, it's time to talk about containment and then reversing that specific control that they have in the environment, right? That's not necessarily avoidance, but that's, the first critical step to making sure you can even move to the stage of restoring your systems from a backup, right? And in our experience, that's sometimes the most protracted part of the recovery is setting up new policies or setting up new rules in your firewalls, your Active Directory, and other key systems that control what your workstations and servers can do, and that's before you can get to the point where you can safely reimage those domain controllers and systems and other things that are going to come back online one at a time, right? You have to get rid of that control. And so, that's kind of the critical time sensitive issues to have, those kinds of capabilities up front, which speaks to, what controls to implement. In our experience, when it comes to recovery, right, the backups, everybody will say are critical. They're critical as to whether you have to pay or feel like you are in a position where you won't get your systems back, that will have the data that'll keep them running like they were the day you got encrypted, unless you have the backup of that information somewhere, right, and hopefully offline and hopefully not on the same network like Valecia was saying, but. In our experience, right, it's just understanding that this is something you can prepare for, having the right artifacts, the right teams already in place. Certainly, our mandate was to try to secure small businesses by making sure that the information we were collecting wasn't, optional or, based on systems they had, right? We're not going to connect, debug logs and hope for the best, right? We know what data we need when these things happen. We know how to find and stop the adversary. Many other firms that are deployed as IR retainers inside insurance companies know the same thing, but they deploy it after the fact, right? So you have no flight recorder for the incident, and then now you're coming in after the fact to try to reconstruct, and that's very expensive. So, certainly for us, if that's a key time frame, is dwell time and being able to contain, the best thing you can spend money on, I'd say would be something like a service like that is those seasoned practitioners with the right data, the right tools, the right capability to block proactively, contain immediately, 24 hours a day, those kinds of things, because it is going to happen on Thanksgiving weekend, right, or in the middle of the night. But then you also have, if you don't want to spend money, right, where do you, have the best effect on this? And it's always come down to some very basic hygiene principles. And they're peppered into, of course, the blueprint in different places, but something simple as, inbound firewall rules on your workstations so that, things can't spread exponentially or like a fission reaction when these things happen. The breakout isn't, 100%, right? So you can save some systems to the attack, compartmentalizing and segmenting, right? Those things don't cost hard dollars in terms of new software that you need. They may cost soft costs of administrative time to set them all up, but they could be key at slowing down and reducing the impact, especially to people like manufacturers who typically run, flat networks on, legacy systems that, are vulnerable to these types of things and have pretty strapped IT resources because they spend a lot of money on the other stuff, right? So, I think that for the money, sure, 24/7 IR retainer protections, types of things would help. But proactively, even just something like policies to slow things down, or in our experience, the make or break systems. And I can't tell you just how many times we've responded to an incident, and I can't even help but remind people how lucky they were to keep that one domain controller, or that the permissions in VM just happened to be different for the databases and backups than the administrator that was compromised. So they weren't domain credentials, right? Like the freak accident protections that they had by, for remembering to disconnect, or oops, that USB drive lost power. And so it wasn't attached storage at the time of the attack. And that was the only thing we had to restore our domain controllers. It has happened more times than I'd like to admit that we got very lucky in those incidents, as opposed to practicing and making sure that we could keep things offline and protected, or set up the right things a priori. like in this framework, to protect them, slow things down, so that gives them an opportunity to act, because it is a game of minutes when this stuff is happening, right? The average breakout time is 1 hour and 38 minutes from the time of initial infection to breaking out to other computers. And then, I've seen whole networks completely encrypted in less than an hour, right? So, you do have not a lot of time to be able to react, right? And recover.
Yeah, very good point. And you don't want to have to be relying on luck, because it happens quick. I remember one incident. I was working when I was in the White House, and the adversary was so deep and so fast. They asked, to your point, like just the opposite. Like, is there anything left? Is there anything that we can trust or salvage? And the incident responder on the site, I think their technical term was, the recommendation was, take an axe to the domain controllers. Literally just melt them down. That's the only thing they're good for now, is scrap. You don't want to have to be in that situation or relying on luck that maybe something was disconnected from the network at the time. John, you've worked both on incidents like that, the national security side, and with a lot of small and medium businesses now at Venable. What are some of the mistakes that you've seen entities, especially like small and medium-sized organizations, make in these kind of areas of instant response planning or data recovery, that leave them in that state where they have to take an axe to their domain controllers?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think, sort of my top couple would be to reinforce some things that both Valecia and Adam talked about, which is, well, kind of work in reverse order. I think I see a lot of companies, a lot of organizations, they don't know how to take advantage of what they already have, right? So Adam talked about the fact that there are things you can do with, whether it's Windows or Linux, or whether you're in the cloud or on-prem or whatever. You've already bought that software, you've already bought that hardware. You can do a lot there in terms of configuring those, securing those, just keeping your patches up to date, right? Not trying to minimize that can be difficult in a number of circumstances, but there are a lot of things that you can do. And I do see a lot of organizations who, they lose sight of the fact that you don't always have to buy a bunch of new tools. You can use what you have as a starting point. That said, running a business costs money, right? And so cybersecurity is an expense like running any other part of the business. And I think it's important, whether you look at the blueprint as a shopping list or it sort of guides you in that direction, you have to be prepared to make investments in the right way. And oftentimes that investment does mean new tools. And so one of the challenges that I've seen with small and medium businesses, and this happens, I think we were talking about it before, it's about 50% of the time. I'll go in, work an incident with a company. We bring in a forensic company. We bring in the tools, right? We get the desktop tools going. We got the whole incident. We contain, we eradicate, we do the whole thing. And then they're like, well, thanks, we're done. And they don't continue on with the tools or the services at all. They just get rid of them because now they're like, well, I've been through my incident. I don't need these tools anymore. And they don't want to hear that maybe you need to keep that investment going, that you need to keep those things in your environment to some degree. So again, it's always going to be a balancing act, and every organization's circumstances and risk profile is going to be a little different. I get that, but I think generally speaking, leadership needs to be educated enough about using what you already have and investing in the time and education necessary to take advantage of that. But then also taking the time to understand and make informed decisions about, we do need some additional tools, right? We do need to do some additional things, and here's why, and here's how that's going to help us. Hopefully you can do that before you have a major incident. As we all know, for most, it happens afterwards. But nevertheless, I think it's that more proactive understanding of what cyber risk means to your organization, no matter how small you are, and investing in the right places and ways to help mitigate that risk. And again, I think coming back to the blueprint, I think that helps in that regard quite a bit.
Yeah, John, your statement about people pulling the tools after the incident, God forbid, I have heard of cases as a cyber insurance provider where the tools after the incident are left in until the claim is paid. And then going forward, to your point, after the claims assessed and being paid out, say, well, maybe we don't actually need to continue this subscription for this tool. And the decision is made, hey, let's de-invest from this security control, even though we just had to go through all the pain of an incident, which, from a security practitioner standpoint seems crazy. But now, having been an entrepreneur and small business owner, you really start to think about some of those costs. And, honestly, when I look at even things like IG1, which, CIS has done an amazing job building, like, this is like the floor, right? Not the ceiling. This is where all organizations should start. It's expensive. Like, it's expensive to completely implement IG1. And Adam, I know you guys do a ton of work piecing together these controls. Let me talk a little bit about some of the costs of cybersecurity, and even if it can't invest in everything, how do you guys help customers, and even as a security company yourself, I'd be interested to know, how do you guys prioritize among those controls, and where you sort of put your first dollars?
I mean, it's tough, I think, for a lot of people listening to this. Most of the buyers of these, components, tools, services are part of IT, right? I mean, so if you look at cybersecurity in general, it's about 6 to 10%, depending on your industry. Energy and finance spending probably 10%. Most people spending around 6% of their IT budget on cybersecurity, right? Netting out to those, bigger yearly revenues that we talked about, aggregate. But adoption is still pretty low, right? You're still, likely, when you think about kind of a comprehensive SOC, right, 25%, or less of companies have adopted these types of services or operations, right, in the small to medium business that is affected most by these systems. And that's, I think, where those numbers actually come from in terms of ransomware success. But when it comes to decision making, right, I've seen a lot of different attitudes towards it, but mostly I've seen a lot of preferences. And the problem is that when you're selling something to an IT practitioner, most of the time what they want to do is buy something that makes their job easier, right? Faster, more effective. They want to be able to take the mandate they've been given in their roles and responsibilities. It's not my job to do this, this, and that, right? And try to simplify, refactor the problem to maybe a few different approaches that allows them to try in their minds to sidestep the issue, right? Oh, ransomware is not going to be a problem because we're only in the cloud. Or, we've got this policy server that, anything that is changed has to be authorized by this person. So, there's not going to be any system exploit that's going to step outside of that, right? And so you kind of, you see almost like, I'm not going to call it head in the sand, but no one's taking a data-driven approach most of the time. They can't articulate specifically where their gaps are without the help of some of these frameworks. And I would add MITRE to these types of frameworks and other frameworks like it that try to compartmentalize the attack vectors, and not just best practices that are exceptionally good at benchmarking and helping people use the stuff they got the best they can. And so the decision really is about the current threat actor. It's coming mostly from our departments and in the knowledge of threat intelligence, right? What are the attacks that are succeeding right now that are most likely to hit these small to medium businesses? What techniques are they using within those stages of the attack life cycle to infiltrate the network, laterally move and deploy their new wares? Because the ransomware story is that playbook, right? And so as you look at, every time there's a new Hafnium, like that exploited exchange, or Quantum, or Black Hat, or, you name it, Conti Group, right? Whoever's getting Revil, right? The dark side. These groups that are getting, famous collecting, cryptocurrency based on these extortion attacks, they're modeling different playbooks, at least slightly different. Going through the same attack stages with slightly different techniques and getting to the point where they can successfully deploy their new ransomware or ransomware they bought as a service. And understanding your effectiveness at those playbooks as they continually change, that's how you should be making a decision as to how to invest, right? And when we think about our service, right, and many like it, right, we believe there's obviously three things to try to cut down your dwell time, the amount of time an attacker has control of your operating systems that allows them to get to the point of deploying something with material damage, which is something like block rate, right? How many of those stages are you able to block outright and be notified to, right? How many of those things allow you to react within a short window? Let's say, can you get rid of an attacker in 20 minutes that's running this playbook, or the next one? Is it 2 minutes? Is it an hour and a half? And that dwell time is very critical, because how long it takes them to use that dwell time to do something else and pivot. But then also, signal to noise ratio, which is kind of an engineering term for how many alerts, how in the loop were you about what was going on, to try to simplify the process of now doing what we call incident response, right? Which is saying, okay, I'm in the middle of an attack. I've got this much information in front of my face. I now know how to communicate, who to communicate to, all the other stakeholders that are going to minimize and make it easy to be transparent about this issue, right? And so those are kind of the main three ways that we sort of try to distill down the mathematics on whether or not you are able to defend against current state attacks in your environment. What we sort of put in Leave Behinds here is a sort of free assessment of that, to sort of help you understand where that is, including walking you through the ransomware blueprint, because it's not like the blueprint was designed to cut out, critical pieces of this and just say, look, this is the most affordable, simplest one silver bullet that you're going to do. It does have the weight of the CIS benchmarks, which tries to capture that full idea of how to protect your networks and your endpoints and your clouds, but having that kind of condensed to a few key pillars of those things, like in the IGs, you have now this sort of crawl, walk, run approach to do it. If you don't understand your gaps relative to the whole thing, that's what we want to try to do. That's the idea of helping you spread this awareness, because if you can make a decision based on data, you're placing better bets, almost like the movie Moneyball, right? If you're trying to win the game by winning runs, you probably have a nice understanding of how this is played if you can assess across the framework and not just over-index on something like recovery or over-index on this, right? Because and it's true, it's spreading it out is going to be a difficult financial decision where you're just doing only a teensy bit of everything. That's not going to help either, which is why the blueprint says, okay, here's some cornerstones to plug in your dollars. So if you're going to invest, you can prioritize this way. To make sure that blocks of these things are stage gated, because you have to protect the attacks at each stage, right? So that really, to me, is how we're trying to make these decisions without having to tell you about the MITRE stages, 14 stages, 240 techniques, thousands of sub techniques, millions of samples, and then your head just goes, oh, this is impossible, and it changes every day. Like that's impossible to keep track of, right? But you can distill it down to say, look, there are teams that will have done and will do and continue to do these research, the research work to distill this down to the mitigations you can put in and understanding how the detections would work at each stage. And so I think that's really easy to digest. You just have to sort of see it, right? And that's how I think you should be making a decision, is based on data instead of based on your role or what makes your job easier, or sort of a flawed understanding of how you're going to disrupt this.
Yeah, that's right. It's like so complex to piece together, as you said, all those data points into an effective defense. What I think is also challenging on top of that, right, is the meta level game of then you have to go get the money for it. And you've got to go explain this to non-technical executives. And, one of the things we run into all the time is, if we're talking to a CISO about the insurance policy and coverage and about the controls they have in place and things they might be able to do to improve their policy, right? They come back and are like, well, this is great, but I also have to make the budget justification for the investment, even if I know what to do, right? If I get to that part. And that means they have to go break their silo. They have to break out of this huge amount of work that they've done within their technical silo to understand the technical threat and mitigation, and then go into a business silo and make the business case for all of this. We've been lucky on the insurance side that at least the policy offers some ability to quantify the risk a little bit and say, well, the risk is this much because it's aligned to your coverage and your premium. So we assess that this is the level of pain you guys might have if you don't make this investment. But John, you've done a lot of discussions with executive teams too. What have you seen be effective in taking all the work that Adam talked about and just trying to explain it up the chain in a way that impacts the business?
Yeah, no, well, I mean, and that's exactly right. I mean, you have to take the risk that is presented by cybersecurity weaknesses And you have to translate it into business risk. You have to translate it into something that the leadership can understand from their perspective. And I'm not saying that leadership has a pass on being educated about technology, not at all, right? I mean, part of it needs to be that leaders need to understand how technology impacts their business. That's easier in some places than others. And I forget who it was, but years ago, I heard a colleague of mine say something like, every company is an IT company these days, right? Because everybody is dependent upon IT, the internet, and so on. I continually run into leadership who still hasn't quite internalized that. They know computers are important, obviously, but they haven't internalized the systemic risk that weaknesses in that technology and being unprepared for when that technology goes down. I find one of the most basic questions that I can ask of a senior leader to kind of get the conversation is, what would happen if you came into your office tomorrow and you couldn't access your computer? Let's just start with something simple, right? You can't get on your computer, you can't access your files, you can't get your emails. Or what would happen if you came in and found out all of your CEO emails are now up on, paste bin somewhere, right? Or for sale on the dark web. Simple questions like that often just get the conversation started, because now for the CEO or the CFO or whoever it is, now it's personal, right? Now it's like, oh, I hadn't thought about that. I always was just figuring my IT people were going to take care of that, or we had backups, or we had whatever. So what works for me is find the questions that are going to resonate with the individuals who need to be demonstrating leadership. And the one final point I'll make on that is that I'm a huge proponent of the fact that attitude does reflect leadership. You see it all the time when a leader decides security is going to matter to them. It will matter to the rest of the organization. It's not a panacea, it's not a silver bullet, but it will matter. And I've seen that in numerous cases. When I was in the White House, there was we'll call it a particular security process that had been in place that nobody was following. And we finally convinced a very senior person there to say, this is really important, we need to do this. And this individual sent a note out to everybody and said, in 2 weeks, I'm going to start doing this process, and I expect everybody to do the same thing. And guess what? Everybody started following the process, not because we changed the technology, not because we implemented some sort of crazy punishment. It was because the person we were all working for, they said it was important. So convincing leadership, absolutely essential. Make the risk real to them is sort of the way to start to do that. And you'll go a long way to not only getting the right processes in place, getting the right attitude in place, but hopefully the right investments once those individuals understand why they need to spend the money.
Yeah, John, I've been inspired by your leadership a lot of my career, right? But I agree, some of the things I learned from you from the start too is, leading with FUD never sells, right? But you make things practical and you show the opportunity for positive growth. I know, one of the things we worked on in the NSC, another example from government times, was the chip and pin payment card switchover. And, where we were able to work with the card makers to have all federal cards deploy a chip so that we wouldn't just have to have a quick 4-digit PIN code on ATM cards. And that acquisition decision by the federal government was a big enough business case to say to a lot of the card makers, hey, we can now roll this out to the rest of the United States. And, it's issues like, everybody remembers the Target breach, right? Like, a lot of this was because of unencrypted point of sale threats. And we don't see those as much anymore because of that. And aligning, like you said, aligning senior leadership to see the opportunity in security, it always ends up in a stronger investment than coming in, like you said, being punitive, saying, if you don't do this, like, it's going to be serious repercussions. Or if you end up not making this, the sky is going to fall. But because ultimately, right, if you're leading with a FUD approach, of fear, uncertainty, and doubt, A, if that fear doesn't come true, you lose credibility. And B, from everything I've seen, companies will only do just enough so that they mitigate that fear or they push that fear behind something else. But if you look at, companies going through digital transformation, which as you said, every company is an internet company. Every company is a digital company now, right? Like, especially after the pandemic, with the move to work from home and the flatness now of networks with people logging in from laptops and mobile phones. Taking advantage of that digital transformation really requires thinking about the risk at a senior level. And then I think the investments in time and controls that Adam talked about don't seem like that big of an investment when you compare it to the revenue that's coming in from these.
Hey, Davis, 10 seconds. And then I promise to be quiet. I want to just add one thing to that. It's cliche, but it really is about leaders leading from the front, right? And being a good example. And I see a lot of cases where a CEO or whoever gets special exceptions to security rules because it's inconvenient, right? They don't have to use a VPN. They can have simple passwords. They don't want to have to unlock their phone, whatever it is. That just does not work, right? Those companies will always be in worse shape. So really, if you're out there, you're listening to this, you're in a leadership position, you need to be leading by example, because otherwise nothing else you do is really going to work as effectively as it could. All right, I'm done.
No, you're absolutely right. And actually, I still remember my old boss, Mark McLaughlin at Palo Alto Networks, worked with the marketing team to make short security videos. They were hilarious. He's a great actor. I don't know if they're on YouTube, but I think at one time an intern locked him out of the building and wouldn't let him back in because he didn't have his badge with him. But that type of culture really matters and really sticks with people. So I agree. If you're a leader on this call, really think about what you can do in your day-to-day to set that right tone. And if you're someone who's working to inform leaders, Valecia, I wanted to talk. I know we've talked a little bit about what pieces of the blueprint could you use to help with some of that education. I know there's the tool, which is the matrix of every control you must do, but I would never put that control matrix in front of a CFO.
Yeah, so I think the biggest thing is to start small, like I said. So, if you're looking at that tooling document and you're getting overwhelmed of where to start, figure out what is realistic for you, right? So if you're a really small business and you can't procure a tool for inventory of your assets, whip out an Excel spreadsheet. I mean, yeah, it's not 100% ideal. It's not going to, it's not a preventative measure per se, but if an incident occurs, you bet your bottom dollar that at least some kind of visibility into your network is going to be more helpful than absolutely none. I also agree with John, convincing leadership can be challenging and an issue. So, I just wanted to make a quick note on that, is that if you're trying to implement a certain technology and the leadership doesn't see it as valuable because there's no imminent threat in their eyes, I think it's important to find those resources, such as, the blueprint is based or use the CIS community defense model to back that with data and present that, in your case. I just wanted to make that quick note. But as far as the tooling goes and how to use the blueprint, those tools are resources. They're not, there's tons of tools out there, right? That list is not comprehensive from start to finish, but it can give you that starting point of trying to figure out what kinds of tools do I need, and who can provide them even. But the other thing too to remember is that there are a lot of free resources, right? So don't get discouraged if you think, if you're looking at prices of EDRs and you're like, oh my God, it's so expensive, I'm never going to be able to do that. Eventually maybe you will get there if it's appropriate for your organization, but don't get discouraged and say, well, I should just do nothing because I can't afford an EDR, so therefore I can't do anything. Just start somewhere, because starting somewhere, you grow little by little. I remember seeing a webinar a few months ago where an organization, it was a state local government, and they had really walked through their experience of setting up asset management. And they started with an Excel spreadsheet, and now they have a fully automated tool that does it from soup to nuts, and which is great to see, right? Because they knew realistically they couldn't do that in the beginning, but then they little by little grew their resources and their efforts, and then eventually got and worked their way up to an automated process. Security is not developed in a vacuum or a bubble. It takes time, it takes money, it takes resources and patience, a lot of patience, right? And I think the other thing, I don't know if it was Adam or John said, if you're defending against 70% of the attack techniques, You have the critics out there who say, well, what about 100%? Well, I don't think any of this is the silver bullet. None of it's 100% guaranteed. But if you at least start implementing some of these safeguards, you're going to be more prepared than if you just did nothing.
No, I agree. And you had some great advice earlier, Valecia, where you talked about even the report itself can be a tool as it goes through, just like the plain text, being able to pull out pieces and then put that into budget justification. After you've used the tool, you've prioritized, you can just go back out. You're not the world's best writer because you're awesome cybersecurity ninja. Just use Valecia's text. It's wonderfully written and very simple, and makes a great filler text for some budget justification.
Yeah, I want to make one quick note on that. And because I've lived that, where literally I had an incident where they were, saying, oh, I don't want to shut down the network because there was an emotet infection. And I had to get on the phone and convince leadership that they needed to, a third party that had no skin in the game, right? And it sounds insane. Like, why wouldn't they just listen to the IT administrator? They're the ones saying that something's wrong. They're the ones with the hands on the network. I had no hands on their network. But it's true, right? Having another third party to validate the action, the budget justification, whatever you're trying to do, sometimes helps. I've seen it time and time again in different scenarios. So I just wanted to leave that note.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we have about a few minutes left, maybe enough for a quick lightning round. If we all want to drop just a few pearls of wisdom from these questions and keep our responses short. I think we can get a few questions in. So one that I'm reading here, this is a good one. Will frameworks ever be updated fast enough to keep up with the adversaries? Oh, that's a good one. Yeah. So when's this going to be outdated?
I'm happy to field that. I mean, certainly the job of the community working together with threat intelligence and these frameworks is to make sure that they can adapt to the benchmarks that change with the versions of your software. I mean, kudos to CIS. I've always used them as the benchmarking for new versions of O365 hardening every year, or Palo Alto Networks, where you came from, right? They're the ones with the hardening guide to tell you how to configure that stuff, right? And so while there's contributors, of course, from those organizations that make the software and everything else, that's an excellent place to show you that they are keeping pace. It is up to date. It is a community-driven effort that is staying up to date. MITRE released, I think we're on version 12, right? Like they continue to adapt the frameworks: cloud, mobile, IoT, enterprise, Windows, Linux, Mac, right? Every time there's a new detection, this is a community-driven effort to keep those things up to date. And for the intelligence community and the service providers that are out there helping to map back to these things, to show you where you're at, to kind of keep you in lockstep with the attacker, I think is true. But like we said, there's a lot of frameworks out there. While the framework could be up to date, it's you keeping yourself up to date with whether or not you are addressing those things. That's probably going to be what lags behind. It's that, it's not 100%, or it's not up to date, so I'm just going to forget about it. And it's like, well, no, if you should meet it where it was too, because now you're saying, well, it's not perfect because it's not the latest and greatest. You still have this old software you could have hardened against stuff and you didn't, right? Like this, that to me is really it. So it's committing the time and not just the budget to doing this. And I know I don't have time probably for closing remarks, so I will say that if cost and complexity is a function of this, we're offering our time. We all offered our time to contribute to this, of course, but ActZero is offering sessions to walk you through the framework, to give you a report. So you just have to answer questions, right? If you can take a couple hours to answer questions, you can get a copy of this of your current security posture against both the ransomware outbreaks that we can test with our simulations, as well as the blueprint as we see it in your organization from the way you answer the question. So I'll leave it at that, to say that yes, they can keep it up to date, but you need to have somebody keeping you up to date with them, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the closing thoughts are that the cyber insurance industry needs to do better at staying up to date as well. It oftentimes is way too much of a lagging indicator in underwriting. John, Valecia, any last thoughts?
Yeah, very quickly. I think Valecia actually said it really well just a couple minutes ago. Don't get discouraged, right? I mean, I think that should be the cybersecurity motto, because it is easy to get discouraged no matter where you are. do what you can where you are. Trust that things like the blueprint are giving you good advice, and don't get discouraged. Continue to work on being better, but don't decide to do nothing. You should be doing something regardless of what it is.
Thank you. And Valecia?
Yeah. Yep, I think I just add, because I know we're at time, to go to cisecurity.org, and we also have Workbench, which is a collaboration community, to just take advantage of those resources. So if you're not finding everything you need right in the blueprint, there are links in the appendix that can guide you to other resources too.
Excellent. Well, I want to thank all of you guys, not just for coming on the webinar today, but for all the work you've done over the past several months on the blueprint. I encourage everybody listening, read the report. It's not that long. It's easily digestible. And then go on and try some of the numerous free tools. Resilience has contributed an instant response checklist. Adam said ActZero has some great tools. CIS, everything they do is wonderful, and it's all for free online. And Venable and John have been incredible sponsors of not just this effort, but other efforts promoting strong cybersecurity in industry. I'd encourage everybody to check out the Cyber Coalition, which John helps run as well. Well, thank you very much. Thank you for joining us today, and we look forward to having everybody on our next webinar. We have 3 more after this, including the last one, plugging for resilience, that we'll be hosting on cyber insurance. So if you guys are interested in learning the deep world of insurance, look for that at the end of November. And thank you very much.
Great. Thank you.